When asked why zombies are currently so popular, Max Brooks, the author of the Zombie Survival Guide and World War Z, had this to say. We're living in uncertain times. People have a lot of anxiety about the future. They're constantly being battered with these very scary, very global catastrophes. I think a lot of people think the system is breaking down, and just like the 1970s, people need a safe place to explore their apocalyptic worries. They can't read stories about real plagues or nuclear war. That's too scary. That'll make them turn away. Zombie stories give people the opportunity to witness the end of the world they've been secretly wondering about, while, at the same time, allowing themselves to sleep at night because the catalyst of that end is fictional. This is the No Fear Cast. We know what scares you. Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
I'm Lisa, and this is the No Fear Podcast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is the third episode in our series on zombies, so it might be helpful to listen to them in order.
Well, to start things off, I kind of want to actually go back to the quote that we had from Max Brooks that was our intro to the show, because I think it's a really interesting quote. That's obviously why I chose it there. But I like this idea, and I think he did a really good job of explaining this idea of zombies in movies and fiction and even comic books, if you bring in The Walking Dead, as being the sort of safe place for us to explore these apocalyptic worries. I know it's something we've kind of talked about before in, I think, some of our very first episodes about how horror lets us explore these things that we may not otherwise be able to deal with in our current lives or whatever, in ways that allow us to look at these things in ways that we wouldn't be able to live out in our own lives. So, I definitely agree with him that, you always have in zombie movies or TV shows or comic books or whatever, it is this apocalypse and either humanity being driven to the brink of extinction or other sorts of things. And while the zombies themselves may not be nuclear annihilation or plagues, they certainly could stand in for that sort of apocalyptic fear that I think is very real in our current day and time. And I think it's worth noting too that quote was from an article that was published in 2014. So, I think it's still very real 2 years later.
Yeah, I agree as well. I feel like, the part where he talks about you can't read stories about real plagues or nuclear war. We can to a certain extent, I think, but it's like it puts it in our face and it makes it so real that I think it almost stops us. Like, it's very difficult to even think about that. I was thinking while you were reading the quote, Matt, about that movie from the early 80s, I think 1983, The Day After, that depicted actual nuclear war and apocalypse and nuclear winter. And it is soul-crushing, which it needs to be. It needs to show people how horrible these things really are. But like the reality of it really bothered people and upset people severely, so that, film scholars talk about just the trauma of even watching that movie. And I watched it a year or so ago on YouTube, and it just leaves you, it just leaves you feeling this kind of terror, because even though it's depicting something happening in the 80s, I think we can definitely still see things like this happening in the 2000s. And I think we're even more attuned maybe to apocalyptic visions of the future now, with all the issues that we're having to deal with globally. And there is something to using the supernatural or the horror genre as a metaphor for those fears that maybe give us a medium or some sort of like space between where we can think about those fears without being completely overwhelmed by them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned The Day After, which fantastic movie, and especially as a made-for-TV movie. I also think of I saw the original, not the stupid remake, the movie Red Dawn, back still during the Reagan years, where communism and invasion by Cuba and Russia was still a threat. And it wasn't as feared as it was maybe during the 60s or the 70s, but it was still there. And while most of the movie is just kind of stupid, the beginning of it, where there's people parachuting in and landing on this like high school football field and then shooting a teacher in front of the students, that was that was a really scary thing for me. Or I even think of Cormac McCarthy's book, The Road, which I read a few years ago. And that book left me numb inside for quite a while. And it lingered in a way that zombie movies don't necessarily linger in my psyche. And, I mean, I totally agree with Max Brooks on that actually confronting that in something like The Road or The Day After, it's a good thing to do, I suppose, but it's really hard and soul-crushing and brutal, whereas we can watch something like Dawn of the Dead or even Zombieland, I guess, and not feel that soul-crushing emptiness, I guess, that comes along with it. Not in the same way, that's for sure.
Well, I think that's part of the appeal of some of these zombie movies. You brought up Zombieland, that is a really fun movie to watch. I remember seeing that in the theater and not really knowing what to expect out of it other than, it said had zombie in the title, so that I knew a little bit of what I was getting into, but it ended up being a really fun movie. But even in the opening of that, you have the really fast-paced rock music, and it's almost gleeful in the killing of the zombies and the splatter of the blood. But in that movie, almost immediately you get the rules established for you quite clearly. They're written on the screen in front of you. And it is kind of meant tongue-in-cheek, but we do find a lot of comfort in that because, and this is one thing that we've talked about, sometimes in zombie movies, or these, if you want to call it these broader apocalyptic movies and books, you have an explanation about what happened, why things are the way they are. But more often than not, I think you can say that we don't know the reason why everything went bad. In almost all of Romero's movies, you don't know why they're coming back, especially Night of the Living Dead. They're just there. I think there's a reference to, a satellite crashing?
Yes.
So kind of a vague reference to aliens, but you still don't know the reason why that is. In the Walking Dead TV show, you don't find out until later that it's due to some sort of virus. When Rick first wakes up in the hospital, he has no clue what's going on. It's been a while since I read The Road, but is there a reason given?
I think The Road was a nuclear war that was the cause of that one. But while you were talking about the rules in Zombieland, I'm glad you brought up The Walking Dead as well, because I think that's a great contrast to Zombieland. I think one of the comforts of Zombieland is having the rules written on the screen for you, just like you said, because we're suddenly navigating this world that looks very similar to ours, but obviously has completely different rules. And I would even argue that The Walking Dead is this ongoing examination of how people learn to relive in a society where the rules have been completely changed and the order has been completely changed. And you get people like Rick and his group that seem to be looking out for each other and trying to embody the best that humanity can offer in a situation like this. And then you have these villainous characters like the governor or the recently introduced Negan, who are the absolute worst of humanity that comes out in this social upheaval. So I think one of the anxieties of The Walking Dead, aside from getting bitten and turning into a zombie, is that you don't know how people are going to react whenever these survivors and these people that you've come to care about through these mini seasons encounter new people. Are they going to be good people and people worth keeping around, or are they going to be people that are going to kill you and take your things or try to eat you like they did in the Terminus sort of plot?
Yeah, I was thinking a very similar thing, Matt, when Lisa was talking about the rules in Zombieland, because, Zombieland in some ways is kind of, yes, the tongue-in-cheek, like laughing to keep from crying kind of thing, but you definitely see this, like, survivors in a world where society has crashed. Like, there is no order, there is nothing coming from the top telling us what to do. And once you're in that kind of situation and you're reinterpreting what needs to be done and you're creating order, you're trying to map order onto something that has no order, you're at the whims of whoever has power at the time, which leads to some of these situations that you're describing in The Walking Dead. And it also kind of reminded me of, remember the CDC using a zombie attack to teach people how to prepare for apocalypse, that there are just kind of rules that you need to use to prepare for natural disasters or pandemics, etc. So zombies kind of become our way of dealing with emergency, or, how do you react when something like this happens?
I mean, we need those rules, and that's what we're looking for, because that's what's so terrifying in an apocalyptic type situation, is that everything crumbles. Matt, you brought up Negan a while back, and he is an excellent villain, but he also lives by a very strict set of rules. Everything in his mind makes sense, and he has created a world that he thinks will survive. We may be horrified by the things that he does, but he's keeping order. And he is providing for his people, and he's taking care of his people. And I think that is what, when we really get down to the core of a zombie apocalyptic storyline, that's what terrifies us, is that either we don't have rules or that we'll fall into the wrong set of rules. You go back to something like Dawn of the Dead. A lot of people read that setting in the shopping mall as being a commentary on our consumerist culture. But you could also read it another way and look at it as we are completely reliant on other people to provide us what we need. We are reliant on, if there is a virus that comes along, we can take medicine to get better. If we're hungry, we go to the grocery store, we get food. If we're cold or our shoes get holes in them, we go to the store and we buy new clothes, we buy new shoes, we buy everything we need. And I think even now, maybe this may be why we're turning to the zombie narrative. I think everything is so technological that you click a button and you get what you need delivered to your door. Right now, I have, which is kind of ridiculous, but I love them, I have those Amazon Dash buttons, and when I run out of toilet paper in my house, I push a button, and 2 days later, toilet paper shows up at my door. And there is now this greater fear that if something catastrophic happens, and all you have to do is watch the news, to get any number of things that could cause a catastrophe, whether it's virus or war or, nuclear weapons, whatever, some extremist group coming in and taking over the government. You don't have to go very far to imagine anything that could happen. And I think there's this fear, maybe rightly so, that if things start to crumble, we don't have the skills anymore to survive, and that we would have to rely on someone like Negan or the governor.
Well, and I think the fear, too, is that if things were to crumble, like you said, these things would eventually run out. The canned foods would eventually be eaten or expire. We'd eventually go through our supplies of shoes. And I think even people who are somewhat able to take care of themselves, I'm thinking of, say, a farmer. They would know how to grow their own food, but let's say they're able to grow wheat. Would they know how to turn that into flour and then turn that into bread? They might know how, but they may not. And so, we're very much, in some ways, reliant on other people because everything is so broken down into such small components. One person might know how to weave and make clothing, but couldn't grow their own food, or all of these different specializations. Everybody's jobs are so specialized, and God forbid we even talk about, someone like a lawyer or someone whose job would be completely gone, except for maybe possibly drafting up the rules to live in the new society. Possibly. I definitely think that is a huge concern. And like you said, we are reliant on other people. If society crumbled tomorrow and I broke my arm, I think I could possibly put it in some sort of makeshift splint or something, but probably not. And I certainly wouldn't know anything about edible foods in the wilderness and that thing, like, oh, those are berries. I might die if I eat them. I don't know. So
trial and error.
Exactly. And but I definitely think that's an important part of these post-apocalyptic stories in general, and zombie stories in particular. And it makes me think of, we keep circling back to The Walking Dead because it's a very popular TV show. It's still currently airing right now. I think they're in their seventh season, maybe sixth. I lost count. That's how long it's been on. But I think of going back. I've been reading the Walking Dead comic for years, and in the very first graphic novel collection, Robert Kirkman, the guy who writes the comic book and also has obviously a huge creative hand in the TV show, he had an introduction, and he talked about how one of the reasons why he started writing this comic book was because he really wanted to focus on the survivors and their stories. And like he said, you know, he always would watch these zombie movies and wonder, well, what happened next? What happened next? What happened next? You know? And I think that's why sometimes in this show and even the comic book, the zombies themselves are sometimes incidental. I think back the first half of season 2 of the TV series, and you see very little zombies. And a lot of people have rightly complained that season 2 was fairly slow, but that was because it was spent way more on character development and establishing this world than it was on running from the zombies constantly, because eventually you're going to exhaust that plot line, and instead let's focus on these survivors and what they're doing in this world.
Well, but it does bring up some really interesting ideas, and this is something that we can save for a later episode series because it's definitely not zombies, but it fits in the same thing. I've been watching a lot of that show Westworld, which is a completely new obsession for me right now, but it brings up the same thing that I think Robert Kirkman is interested in the comic series, is that what do you do and what kind of person do you become when there are really no more consequences? You know, if society has crumbled and there's no law, what do you do? And in The Walking Dead, they always have that really interesting series of questions when they're bringing in new people. What is it? How many zombies have you killed? How many humans have you killed? And why? I think those are the 3 questions.
I think that's it.
I may be getting that wrong. But it is really interesting because that's really the only sense of morality that they have. That's the only compass that they have is, you know, how many people have you killed and why? I get the sense at different points in the show that sometimes not killing can be just as bad as killing somebody. And so it really forces you to confront, you know, if religion is stripped away, if government is stripped away, if just societal politeness is stripped away, who do you become and what governs your actions? And that is one of the really interesting things that a zombie narrative can bring out in people.
Well, not to get too literary with this, but that's actually the exact same idea that Dostoevsky explores in The Brothers Karamazov. So, The Walking Dead has similar elements as a pinnacle of Russian fiction. But... And I say that, and yes, we laugh, but I'm dead serious. There's this one character in The Brothers Karamazov who is sort of the intellectual, and he kind of philosophically questions, well, if I am an atheist and there is no such thing as God, then I guess all things are allowable, and I can do anything because there's no hell, there's no consequences. And he's doing this as a philosophical exercise, and one of his other brothers takes that literally and kills their father. And so, I mean, you see, that's the same thing that you were just saying about The Walking Dead. If religion is stripped away and society is stripped away, if all of these things are gone, then are we still going to be moral or not? Or does morality change to fit the situation? Like, is what's ethical for us now going to be different than what's ethical for us in the post-apocalypse?
And that even questions what humanity is, really. Because what we think of as humanity is so bound up with our idea of the social compact and our existence together that, well, if half the world's population becomes monsters, then what is human? You know, like Lisa was saying, is it human to kill at that point? Is it human to just take care of yourself and your family? Is it human to try to continue some of these social compacts we had before everything fell apart? And then what truly keeps your motivations and your, for lack of a better term, kind of like even desire for power or control in check? I know you can only find out who you really are, maybe in that kind of stripped down apocalyptic setting. Maybe zombie movies make us face that even in ourselves.
Definitely. And philosophically speaking, they certainly seem to fall on the side of, in its simplest form, is that idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The alternative to utilitarianism is usually like what is moral is always moral. Like, killing is wrong and it's always wrong. But these zombie movies and these zombie shows tend to fall more on the side of, well, like Lisa said, sometimes leaving the wrong person alive can have really disastrous consequences. So sometimes it's moral to kill the one person to save the lives of 10 people or 20 people or something like that, which is straightforward utilitarianism. I mean, Rick in The Walking Dead makes it very clear throughout the show as it progresses that he's got his friends, which are basically his family, these survivors, and he's absolutely willing to kill to protect them, without doubt. So in some ways, we're sort of talking about the social commentary aspect of zombies, which, you know, we keep circling back to both in this episode and in our last episode. But one thing that I think is interesting, too, about these sort of modern zombie movies is that they've led to a different kind of social commentary. And I'm thinking in particular, we've already talked about Zombieland a little bit, but also other zombie comedy movies, the first of which was Shaun of the Dead, which was a romantic comedy that happened to have zombies in it as they pitched it. I think they called it a rom-com. So you've got Shaun of the Dead, which is this comedy movie, Zombieland, which is also, I mean, it's a straightforward comedy with the gore and violence of a zombie movie. And as well, the lesser-known movie, and if you haven't seen it and you like zombie movies, absolutely check it out, the movie Fido, which I would say is sort of like a cross between a zombie movie and the movie Pleasantville in certain ways. And I've found it interesting that at least in the 2000s and in, I guess, the 2000 teens, that a lot of the places where the in-your-face social commentary was happening was in this sort of merging of comedy with zombies.
Well, that's kind of what comedy does, right? Like it uses this kind of layer of irony to, I guess, you know, make the pill go down, or like you're laughing, but you're getting a message in the end that they hope will kind of stick in your mind. And so, you know, like Zombieland, I think we talked earlier, it has like the rules and all the different things you would think of in a normal zombie movie or an apocalyptic kind of place. But we also are making fun of like our consumer culture, our, you know, concept of celebrity, even like all these different aspects of our normal lives get kind of brought out in this dark, ironic way.
In particular, you know, it is fun to watch those movies because you watch something like Shaun of the Dead, and I think most of us enjoy a movie like that because I feel like I was watching myself in the middle of a zombie apocalypse. I mean, for a good part of the movie, they don't even realize, the main characters don't realize that there are zombies surrounding them. And I thought that was a really brilliant idea because in so many of these zombie movies, you know, the idea of the zombies are approached with such gravity and seriousness. You know, all of a sudden your child turns rabid and attacks you, and there's no question in anybody's mind that these are zombies and they need to be killed. But in Shaun of the Dead, it's so different because you realize that a zombie walking down the street or rambling down the street looks very similar to a drunk who you're just going to ignore. And so I have a feeling that it would be a much more subtle transition in that way, which we wouldn't quite be sure what was going on. And I'm sure once it hit on a global level, we would have so many political commentators on the air and online telling us it was any number of things and not to be worried, that I can see how something could escalate very quickly without us realizing it. But also just the fact that his main plan is to go to a pub, you know, like, let's just wait for this thing to blow over. And when you look at our modern political landscape, how many people do that? You know, it seems bad right now, but, you know, things are good in our neighborhood. Let's go to the pub and wait for it to blow over. Now, we can laugh. There's something much more sinister, I think, underneath that. And I think the main characters in that movie realize the gravity by the end. But then you take a movie like Fido, which is such and still, I think, undiscovered gem that I wish more people would watch. But just the fact that you see how quickly we could return to kind of a master-slave type society, how quickly we want to rank people, I guess. And we can laugh at it because it is kind of Pleasantville, as you said, meet zombies. But it's also kind of scary when you think about how quickly we want to do that, how quickly we want to say, you are on a lesser scale than I am, and I'm up here, therefore you serve me, and we'll be happy.
Well, to circle back to Shaun of the Dead for just a second, I think, too, what's interesting, if you pay attention to the opening credits of that movie, is the comparison, and they do it throughout the movie, but it's most blatant in the opening credits, is the comparison to our modern society with zombies. They show a group of teenagers all staring at their cell phones, and you have to look and really pay attention to see if they're teenagers who are alive or if they're actual zombies. And so that's where some of that satire plays in. But also, I think the end of Shaun of the Dead is really interesting, because once they've fought back against the zombies and sort of retaken the world, how quickly the zombies are, like in Fido, incorporated into our society in these ways where, like, Shaun and Liz are watching a game show where the zombies are being put through these humiliating, if they were human at least, things where, you know, they've been brought back into our society in a way where we sit and laugh at them in this game show thing and say, oh, look at it, it's trying to get the meat, ha ha ha, it can't. But just the same way Fido, I mean, they've, like you said, they've taken these zombies and turned them into this slave class, which, yeah, there's a very, for those of you that haven't seen Fido, it's sort of this idealistic city where they've taken zombies and put collars on them and turned them into domestic labor. Like, you have a zombie and it's your maid or butler that mows your yard and sweeps your floor and that sort of thing. And so they really do become this element to be pitied, and you begin to feel bad for the zombie, which is a really, really well done thing.
Yeah, I was thinking while you guys were talking, there's a couple of really interesting things going on there. One is, like, it makes you question who you pay attention to and who you ignore in your everyday life, looking at your cell phone and thinking about what you need to do next, and how we kind of have tunnel vision and don't pay attention to people on the street or what's going on. And then the other thing, you know, thinking about your description of Fido, is that in some ways we're going full circle back to our original idea of zombies as people being forced to do things for other people being, you know, their agency being taken away from them and becoming kind of servant or slave class. But it just kind of goes right back to the first episode.
Well, and the thing about Fido, like when I mentioned that it's very much like Pleasantville, Pleasantville is a movie where two kids get sucked into a TV show and end up in like a 1950s sitcom. And really the thing about Fido is it's, I guess, less like, I mean, it is like Pleasantville, but it's more like, I guess, the movie The Help, if you think about it that way, because, like you said, it's two different classes, and there is this segregated society. Only in this case, they're using the idea of zombies to critique that idea of the 1950s segregation, because everything is very idyllic, and it's always sunshiny, and everybody's happy and mowing their yard, and, I mean, it looks like an episode of The Donna Reed Show or Father Knows Best or something like that, except they happen to have zombies that are their maids, and yeah, it really does sort of feel like they're using that to critique that idea of how good the 1950s were. It was this great portrait that was being painted, at least on TV and in our narratives, but when you pull back the curtain, it really wasn't so great. There really was that monster that was there. In this case, segregation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting counterpoint to the discussion that we had at the beginning of this episode. You know, we spent so much time talking about apocalyptic fiction and how the zombie, just the general idea of zombies lends itself to this dystopia. But in these two cases, you are getting a utopian view of the world in a way, although it is pecking away at the perfect nature of it.
Yeah, the dystopia is underneath that veneer, that certain people are experiencing it, but the kind of ironic veil over it is being portrayed.
Yeah, and you look at something, Matt, you were talking about the 1950s and how Fido is kind of a critique on that period, and I agree with you. When you were talking about the film, I was thinking about The Help as well. But it is interesting because we do tend, to some degree to whitewash history and look at our past through rose-colored glasses. And, sometimes you have to remind people that, yeah, you can watch something like the Donna Reed show, and it looks very pleasant, and a lot of people enjoy it. But you think about what was going on in that point of our country's history that we're still feeling the effects of today. And it's really interesting to look at that through the eyes of a zombie, because as you said, Mel, it's somebody whose agency has been completely taken away. And if you stop looking at them as monsters and start pitying them a little bit, I guess, it makes you think about humanity very differently, I think, and this is something we've brought up and we, I think, have been promising that we'll talk about. So I'm just going to go ahead and throw it out there. But let's talk about The Girl with All the Gifts, because I'm itching to talk about that story in that book. I think it hits on a lot of what we've been talking about as far as looking at the zombie as less of a monster and seeing the humanity within it and questioning our own motives and how we treat people.
I have not gotten to this book yet, but I'm really interested in it. The premise of it, right, is that you don't even really know you're reading a zombie book because you're in the main character's mind, right? So you're in I guess we would say the other's mind rather than being like the people who are trying to get away.
Right. This is a book, The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey, and it came out a few years ago. I'm not exactly sure. I'm going to take a guess and say maybe 2013. Possibly 2014, around then. Anyway, it was one of those books that people always said, the less you know about it, the better. But we're going to go ahead and spoil it because there's a movie version that's coming out very soon. And they've already released, I think, some of the stills and maybe the first trailer for it. So I think it's safe to say that spoilers abound. But it's a book about zombies, but you don't know you're reading it because you're getting it from the main character's point of view, who is gradually revealed to be a zombie. And I think part of that, at least, is it allows you a unique perspective of who she is, but also how people react to her. Because she is, like these other zombies, it's zombie children, basically, and they're locked up in some sort of government facility. And they're allowed to be schooled throughout the day to see if they can be, it's almost like an experiment in rehabilitation, I guess. And you find out through this main character that there is indeed a lot of humanity left within them. And so you start looking at who is showing her compassion, who is treating her as just, a monster or an animal. And it starts to change how you feel about the different characters in the book.
I would absolutely agree with you that it reads like a story about rehabilitation because, like you said, they're these zombie children that are allowed to be taught different things, like facts about the world, and told stories and read about like the Greek myths and that sort of thing. I think it is worth mentioning that most of the zombies are the zombies that we think of traditionally. They're incapable of conscious thought, but a very small select few seem to be, as children, seem to be capable of relearning. So it's like they've forgotten everything from before they turned, and now they have to be retaught everything. And so, yeah, it all comes through from her perspective. And I agree that it's really interesting because, like, the way she describes things, she doesn't understand why most of the people don't like her or are mean to her, but she follows their rules about having to wear a mouth guard to keep from biting and things like that. Even though she has no intention of biting them for the most part, she still follows the rules because that's what the rules are. But yeah, you get this really interesting sense of, it's this character who treats her with compassion even though she's a zombie, or it's this character who sees her as a means to an end, or things like that. It is a very unique perspective on the entire thing, and it's absolutely a book that's worth reading. It's got some very interesting takes on how the zombies come about, and it's got a very, very interesting ending that I don't want to spoil. But it's a great book. It really is a very unique perspective on all of this, on who's the monster now kind of thing, in a world that's pretty much overrun with the undead and humanity. There is very little left of. Who is the monster? Yeah,
it does bring up a lot of those questions, and it gives you a vast array of people, because you not only get her teachers, but you get her handlers, the people who I guess would be equivalent to like policemen or prison guards. You get scientists who are studying her. You get government, army type officials. So you get a wide array of people, but you're only getting them through their interaction with her. So it does change how you see those characters than if you would see those same characters, say, on The Walking Dead and interacting with Rick and his gang. But one of the things that's really interesting about that book that I kept thinking about after I finished it was this concept of what is humanity, because as you mentioned, Matt, the main character doesn't retain really anything of her life before. Yeah, so it brings up some interesting ideas about humanity because the main character doesn't hold on to any of her personality before life as a zombie. She doesn't know anything of the world.
Well, I was thinking, I haven't read the book, but I was thinking from what you were just saying just then, it seems like that book is almost unlike the other movies that make us question humanity and think about like what humanity is in a hopeless place. It almost seems like that book shows humanity's resilience. That even if you've lost your personality at one point, you can relearn a type of humanity, like something can survive.
I think that's something that book in particular brings up, Mel, that so far, at least from the things that I've seen and read, that no zombie narrative has really done before. Because if there has been any questioning of, is there humanity left, people always want to know, is my mother left in there? Is my best friend left in there? And even at the end of Shaun of the Dead, the best friend is in the tool shed locked up because he's a zombie, but they've got the TV set up there to play video games. And so it's this idea that something of his best friend is left. But if you take away everything that makes that person who they were before, I don't think any zombie book has tackled that idea of, okay, just because you're different from who you were before, does that mean you shouldn't be saved? Which is something really, I think, interesting and exciting to talk about.
I think the closest analog that we could get to that, and it's not going to be the same story, and it is a very big spoiler for it if you haven't read it, but it's Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. Now, don't I'm not talking about the Will Smith movie. They make some drastic changes to it. It's a fun movie for itself, but it is not the same at all. But the story, the Richard Matheson story, does sort of tackle that because you find out that the main character is the last human. He literally is the last human, and that he is the legend because he is the monster coming in and taking these things and, whatnot. So the legend is that he's the boogeyman, basically. But I think that's the closest comparison, is that humanity has changed and evolved in a way, and, not necessarily a positive way, but it has changed. And I think that's the closest comparison to The Girl with All the Gifts, but there's a lot of huge differences. Like Lisa was saying, that they're a complete tabula rasa, a complete blank slate. And there's some other changes that I don't want to mention just because it would be too big of a spoiler for the book. But anyway, those are the only two stories I can think of, and one isn't a zombie or story at all.
Right, Matt, I hadn't even thought about the Matheson book, but you're absolutely right. Because it brings up the idea, which is, kind of a philosophical question in and of itself. But, is it selfish of us to want to keep humanity the way it is because it's the way we know it and it's the way we're comfortable with it?
I was just thinking it's all about perspective, right? And at the end of I Am Legend, he even says that when he discovers the group of vampire / whatever you want to call them, the evolution, because he says, well, this is a new world and I'm the only human. And so the world is now being built from their perspective. So it's almost difficult to say what's wrong and what's not. You've had this huge apocalyptic catastrophe and this is what survived. Is the survival important, or is it that it stays similar, as Lisa's saying, to what we knew?
Well, we are running out of time. And there is one last question that I sort of wanted to debate and hash out with with both of you. And that is, we've kind of mentioned it in our latest mini episode, which is about the fast versus slow zombies. And we sort of talk about that. So if you're interested, please check us out on Patreon and you'll get access to all of our mini episodes. But what I wanted to talk about here is the movie that sort of led to, I guess we could call it the zombie renaissance that started in the early 2000s, because zombie movies had kind of turned back into camp in the 80s and 90s. And it was the movie 28 Days Later that really, I think, brought back this zombies into pop culture. But the real question I want to ask, and this is something that I asked when I taught a class on zombies, was were the infected in 28 Days Later actual zombies or not? Because if you remember, they are not dead. They are capable of starving to death. And in fact, they do. You see it at the end of the movie that they have not eaten because they're infected with rage. What do you two think? Because I mean, it's something I go back and forth on. They're clearly mindless, and they're so consumed with this virus that they have lost what we would consider humanity. They've lost, as the major, the army major says towards the end of the movie, that they're not going to bake bread, they're not going to write a song. They've lost anything that makes them human, and it to the point where they refuse to eat even, and they die of starvation. So were these things actual zombies, or a kind of zombie, or is it something different? Because keep in mind also that this was the very first incarnation of fast zombies that we ever saw. So what do you two think? Zombies or not?
Well, I remember seeing this movie, and I agree with you, Matt. It was definitely a turning point in the zombie genre, I guess, because it was something very different than I had ever seen before. This is what I'll say. And I was one of those who rolled my eyes as soon as it got to the point in the film where it said they were infected by rage. What we get in 28 Days Later is most definitely a zombie narrative. It follows very closely to things that were familiar before. You've got an apocalyptic type situation. You've definitely got political and social commentary. I mean, when you call something a rage virus, I don't know how much more of social commentary you can add on to that. I mean, he just lays it out for you. He doesn't even let you peel away the layers to get there. When it features, yes, it's a zombie narrative that's not about zombies, if that makes sense. If anything, I would say they were cannibals until they stopped eating. But I guess, yeah, rabies would be the closest thing I would have to it.
Lisa, I agree with you about the idea of zombie narrative and maybe not traditional zombie. But I was wondering, do you think we could maybe say that they were metaphorical zombies, that they have the loss of personality, the kind of husk, like Matt was saying, they're not going to do things that we perceive as human, though I would like to hear a zombie song, but that it's more metaphorical, I guess, than what we would think of as a real zombie in a real zombie movie.
Well, and technically, it really wasn't until Romero that you got the real, true dead person up and walking, actual corpses walking out of the graveyard. Because even when you go back to like the voodoo roots, which this is going all the way back to episode 1 of this series that we talked about, zombies were not truly dead people. It was more of using drugs and religion and societal expectations, I guess. For lack of a better term, using all that to trick somebody into thinking that they were dead and to manipulate them into doing your bidding. So if you want to look at it that way, it may not be a Bokor who is doing this, but really and truly, zombies don't have to be animated corpses. So yeah, I guess you just talked me into it, Mel.
I would agree with you, Lisa, although I will say that if you're talking about the early voodoo zombie movies, such as White Zombie, those people are actually dead and have been reanimated.
I feel like at this point we're just tugging at the strings, because then is Frankenstein's monster a zombie? Did Shelley write a zombie tale? Are cannibals where does it all end?
I absolutely agree with you, Lisa, and I know it was like a quibbling sort of point to bring up, and I agree that 28 Days Later is. I like that idea of saying it's a metaphorical zombie tale, because it really is, and so many people do just say, oh, it's a zombie movie, and it really does give you some good food for thought to, I guess, question, well, were they really zombies? But yeah, I think it really does become a quibble over it all, because yes, they lose the humanity. I mean, it follows the basic overarching themes of zombie movies almost to the T, almost perfectly. So, well, anyway, I just wanted to have that discussion because it's a great movie and I really enjoy it, but it is something that I do like to question, is it really a zombie movie or not? I don't know. It's fun debate.
Yeah, Matt, I'm with you on just the whole concept of what a zombie is sometimes, if I go down that rabbit hole too far, because I could actually argue, okay, if we're saying it's a reanimated corpse, I mean, technically aren't vampires zombies then? But anyway. Yeah, so this is actually the end of our major episode arc on zombies. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you want more of this discussion of zombies, we still have many episodes up exclusively for our Patreon listeners. So if you are interested in something like that, it's only $5 a month, and you will get exclusive mini episodes that are available on our off weeks. So there is more zombies to come, and we hope you enjoy something like that. Our next episode is going to be a very fun one to get us into the Christmas spirit, and we're going to be talking about Charles Dickens and the evolution of the Christmas ghost story. And then we've got a really, really fun episode series planned for the new year. So we'll see you in 2 weeks.
This is the No Fear Podcast. You can find us online at Twitter and Instagram at No Fear Cast. That's KNOW Fearcast. Or our website, nofearcast.com. If you want to contact us, send an email to nofearcast@gmail.com. Download us through iTunes, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, or you can support us on Patreon. Patreon supporters get exclusive access to mini episodes released on the weeks in between our normal schedule. Even a little bit makes a big difference. The No Fear Cast. We know what scares you. This is a personal project and not related to any academic institution. I don't need to be infected to have rage.